Hello, everybody. If I had a penny for every new book about AI, I'd be a rich man, probably as rich as some AI startup entrepreneurs. The latest book, which we're talking about today, is by the AI editor of Fortune magazine, Jeremy Kahn. It's called Mastering AI, a Survivor's Guide to Our Superpowered Future. Jeremy's joining us from his home in Oxford, UK. Jeremy, the subtitle of this book seems to give it all away. A survival guide. Are you in the existential camp when it comes to AI? Is this a threat to all of us as humans?
I'm not in the existential camp to the extent that I think that that is the biggest risk, but I also think it's not a non-existent risk. So I think there's a slight but more than non-zero chance that in the future some AI system could pose a risk to all of us. And I think it makes sense to take some sensible steps now to make sure that never occurs. But I think we should do that. As long as it doesn't, cost the world, and as long as it doesn't suck all the oxygen out of, I think, many other things we should be doing to minimize the risks that this technology presents today, then I think it makes sense to take steps to head off any existential risk. Even though I think the chance of AI actually posing an existential risk is relatively low.
So this survival guide, is it written for people whose jobs, maybe journalists like yourself, doctors, lawyers, fast food workers, is it written mostly on the vocational work front in terms of survival?
So I intended this book for sort of anyone who wants to sort of figure out what the AI revolution is likely to mean to them and to our society as a whole. But definitely, a lot of the book speaks to professionals and concerns about how they're going to be affected by this technology, how they might work with this technology in the future, how it might change their company or their industry. There's quite a lot of that discussion in the book.
Jeremy, you're in the UK, but you're born in Ohio, so you know how journalists always ask the baseball question when it comes to narratives. What inning are we in when it comes to this AI revolution? Has the game started? Are we in the first or second inning? What's the narrative? People have been writing this narrative for years now, for the last 50 years. Has the game begun when it comes to the baseball analogy?
Yeah, I think the game has begun, but it is relatively early innings. I'd say, we are in, maybe the end of the first inning, heading into the top of the second, something like that. It is true that people have been talking about AI technology. The fields existed since 1956 by that name. There were people working on similar technologies even in the decade before that. And it's never quite gotten to the point where I think it was really doing things that made people sit up and take notice. What's happened in the last 2 years, really, since ChatGPT, is the sudden realization of you know this technology having arrived, and many more people sort of having a clear view that this could really affect sort of everything. It could affect their jobs. It could affect the shape of industries. It could change the world in big ways. And this book was an attempt to sort of explain to people how we got to this moment, why this I think is a kind of turning point moment. I think the game actually started essentially. I think in with ChatGPT and where we're likely to go to sort of lay out what the next 8 innings may look like.
There have been what the industry calls AI winters in the past, where funding and initiatives and even the technology seem to shrivel up. Are we beyond the possibility of another AI winter? Could this all be a false alarm? You mentioned OpenAI and ChatGPT. It's clearly an impressive product, but so far, it doesn't seem to me, at least, and we'll get into the details of this perhaps later in the conversation, we have any killer apps when it comes to AI. There's nothing that most normal people are actually using at the moment, AI driven, which AI powered, which is changing their life.
Well, I think we're starting to see the first beginnings of this. We have a lot of people starting to use these kind of co-pilot products at work. I think a lot of software programmers are now relying on something like GitHub Copilot, which is based off of of OpenAI's products, to help them code. So I think we are starting to see the effects of this. But it is true that I don't think we've really found the killer app for this technology yet. But I think there's some potential killer apps sort of on the horizon, including this idea of AI agents, which maybe we can talk a little bit about further. The idea of that you'll have systems that don't just generate text or content for us based on some sort of text prompt, but actually take a series of actions. And I think that is coming. And I think we are going to start to see real effects of this in our lives, in the next very few years.
And we'll get to personal assistants. I know you wrote a piece for Fortune recently about these personal assistants as potentially AI's killer app. Where are we, though, Jeremy, more broadly in the AI economy? I do a weekly tech roundup with my friend Keith Teare, the author of That Was the Week newsletter. And in our show at the weekend, we talked about what we called the AI tech boom of the 2020s, replicating the Wall Street mania of the roaring 1920s. It seems as if the stock market's at record highs, especially big tech companies, which are driving Wall Street. But at the same time, we're not seeing real products. So is there a possibility of a dangerous boom here in economic terms?
I think in terms of financial terms, in terms of the stock market, yes, there's quite a lot of hype out there. This could be a stock market bubble. And you might see some of these companies take a dive at some point. They're very highly valued at this point. And there's quite a lot of competition that tends to happen in capitalism when,
to put it mildly, Jeremy.
Well, when people see profits, it's like everyone jumps in, and then it becomes much harder. And I think, NVIDIA's, if you look at their market cap and their valuation, you'd have to assume that every single AI chip that's ever going to be sold from now for the next 100 years essentially will be an NVIDIA chip. And I mean, I don't think that's a great assumption to make. There's quite a lot of other people out there now trying to create other chips and trying to displace at least some of NVIDIA's lock on this market. And I think, you could see a stock market correction. And you asked in your earlier question about an AI winter. There have been these periods in which there have been huge pullbacks in the technology. People have become very disillusioned. I actually think we're kind of beyond that now in terms of what the technology can do and the way in which people are actually integrating it into real processes. I know you said, and I somewhat agree with you, that we haven't quite found the killer app yet. But I think if you look at what's happening inside businesses, they are very committed to this technology, broadly speaking. And I do not see another kind of AI winter like we had in the 1970s, where really all investment dried up and people wrote the technology off completely. I think you may see a pullback from certain particular flavors of the technology. That people may decide that LLMs are not quite as powerful as they thought, or that they need to be coupled with other sort of technologies. A lot of the book, what I talk about in Mastering AI, is about why I think the design of the specific applications we are going to use matter in some ways a lot more than the power of the underlying models. And right now, there's been a lot of discussion about the underlying models and not a lot of talk about how do we wrap this in a package that people can actually use in their day-to-day jobs. And I think how exactly we do that, the design choices we make in the next 2 years about how to do that, are going to be very significant. And I think if we get that wrong, some people it's possible people become very disillusioned with the technology. We could see a bit of a pullback. I don't think we'll see another AI winter like we saw in the 70s. That's not to say we won't see a stock market, decline. I mean, I think a good analogy here is, what happened in the Industrial Revolution, actually, with steam power and the railway companies. Tons of investment poured into railway companies. There was huge inflation in the stock market. The majority of those railway companies went under. A lot of those investors lost their shirts, but the railways got built, and they actually helped, power the next century of American growth. So I think we may see something kind of similar happen here.
The railway analogy is an important one. Also, the automotive one, of course, the boom, the unsustainable boom of the 20s was very much built around automotive companies. And after the collapse, people still drove, and roads and the automotive industry remained central to the American economy. In terms of trying to historicize this, Jeremy, you mentioned NVIDIA being now the at some points, depending when we talk, it's the most valuable company in the world. It's worth trillions of dollars, and it's, as you say, a chip manufacturer. Is the equivalent the original internet boom in the 90s and the way in which Cisco was radically overvalued as a hardware company powering the internet, and coming back to the killer app issue and applications? Are we still waiting for in thinking about the 1990s, are we still waiting for the Netscape moment? Even before the invention of Netscape as a usable browser in the early 90s, everybody knew the internet was going to be interesting. They just didn't know how to access it. So should we be thinking about the AI revolution in terms of this imminent Netscape moment?
Well, I think we sort of had the Netscape moment, to be honest, Andrew. I think ChatGPT was sort of the Netscape moment. It's the moment, and I think what I mean by that is it's the moment that people suddenly realize, people who were sort of not involved in AI and not involved in technology at all, suddenly realized, oh my God, there's this thing called AI, and it might, really change my life. Oh, this thing seems like it might be able to do aspects of my job. This is amazing. I can talk to it about some very specialized area of knowledge. It seems to be able to converse, very fluently on that. It can do my kids' homework. It can do all these things. I think
not very well, though, usually.
Well, it's okay. It depends what you ask it and how you ask it, and it depends how specialized subject you want it to do. And it's one of the reasons in the book I say I think that we are going to need sort of more specialized co-pilots to really make this work for professionals, for knowledge workers. I think most knowledge workers will need a very specific co-pilot that may have one of these large language models underneath it, but we'll have sort of all this apparatus built on top of that will actually make it work for them as a professional and will enable it to produce reliable answers for them in their work, in our work lives. But no, I think the Netscape moment was really the idea that you could suddenly access these, because the large language models had existed for a couple of years before that. And it was only that we sort of put this chatbot interface on it, that OpenAI did that, and threw it out into the world, and that it kind of caught fire. I think that's a little bit like what happened with Netscape. As you say, there were web browsers prior to Netscape. The internet was around. A lot of academics were using the internet and were very excited about it and what it could potentially do. But the average person had no way of sort of accessing it, had no idea what it was about until Netscape came along. And then even once Netscape came along, I think it took a while till you actually had the real powerhouse businesses being built on top of the internet. And so I think that's what we're waiting for now. I mean, it's unclear if OpenAI will be the Amazon or the that a business of that kind, the eBays of that world. Back, if you look back then,
or Yahoo,
Yahoo for a while. That's an interesting one too. Of course, Yahoo was huge for a while and then really faded, but it had its moment. That moment came a couple years after the kind of Netscape moment, and I think we're still in that period now where I think we've had the Netscape moment, but we're kind of waiting to see what will actually be built on top of this technology.
You used the term, Jeremy, that some people might be confused with. Some people might find a little chilling. Co-pilot. What does that mean, and what do you mean by it?
I mean a system that is designed to assist a particular knowledge worker in a sector, and to be a kind of assistant for them in their job that will help perform specific professional tasks that they need, that person needs to have performed. So if you imagine like a legal co-pilot would be a piece of AI software that would help you perform legal research. If you're a lawyer, would maybe draft initial memos based on that research, might summarize things for you, might draft some contracts for you. It won't do everything. But the point is, it's going to be something that sort of you work alongside, almost like a coworker, but perhaps a more junior coworker or a less experienced coworker or a somewhat unreliable coworker in some cases. But it's going to be helpful enough that you're going to use these things, and you're going to sort of be expected. I think a lot of professions that you will use these things, but I think that the co-pilot that there'll be one of these sort of for each niche, for each profession. So the legal co-pilot will not be the same software that the doctor uses to help write patient notes and potentially to suggest possible diagnoses. I don't think we're going to see any actual diagnoses made directly from AI, but I do think you may have this kind of decision support system where it suggests things to the doctor, and that'll be a medical co-pilot. And then I think architects will have a co-pilot that suggests designs and might even go from design to blueprint and then work up costings, and it'll do these very specific things well. And underneath that, there may be one of these large language models that has the ability to do many different things and kind of be fine-tuned and shaped to perform different functions. But ultimately, I think we're going to have to wrap these in technology and in applications that are very specific to each profession. And then each profession will have a kind of co-pilot, or several probably competing vendors selling co-pilots into those companies in that industry. And people will work alongside these. They will be our kind of new assistant, new coworker, and it'll be as ubiquitous, I think, as if you're using CAD software if you're a designer, or if you're using word processing software if you're a writer.
Explain the difference, Jeremy, between a co-pilot, this future that you're predicting of a verticalized AI, and something that people call AGI. You wrote a piece recently in Fortune about a disagreement between Bill Gates and an OpenAI researcher on the imminence of AGI. This vision you have, which is a fairly practical one, not that dramatic or radical, doesn't suggest that we're going to get to the AGI moment, does it?
No, I mean, I think AGI is still ways off.
And you might just, again, for the broader audience, you might just define.
Yeah, sure. So AGI, which stands for Artificial General Intelligence, is the idea of a single piece of AI software that can perform all of the cognitive functions of a human being as well as a person, basically. And that's in a single system. And I think that's still quite a ways off. I think we have to do there's going to have to be some technological improvements that are unknown to us at the moment in order to reach that moment. I don't think it's going to come from simply scaling up the existing systems ever larger, which some people in the field think could be the path to AGI. I do feel like AGI feels closer, though, than it has felt previously. I started covering AI sort of full time 8 years ago, and at that time, I would have said, it felt like it could easily be 50 years off still. You could come, I would have said, wake me in a century and maybe it'll be here. But now I feel like it's probably closer than that. I mean, I think I can sort of see we might get there, within a decade to 2 decades, but I think it's not imminent. It's not happening next year. It's not probably happening in 5 years.
And is that the ultimate game changer, AGI? Does that change?
Well, that would change a lot of things, because then a single system that could perform all those different functions, you wouldn't need maybe as many vertical vendors. I still think you're going to want to wrap that AGI system probably in various interfaces that are very specific to a profession in order to have it work well. But the idea of AGI really, I think, is a system you could probably say, go off and do this accounting task, and it would be able to do it because it would have ingested all of that. It could go figure out how to be an accountant and go do that. And you could also say to the same system, oh, I have this medical problem, here are the symptoms, and it would make a diagnosis. And you could ask, it's sort of the dream that we have right now with these
or the nightmare, some people.
Yeah.
I mean, is AGI the same as Blade Runner? Is that a
well, not quite. I mean, that's
even between humans and machines.
Yeah, well, I do feel like there's aspects of that dystopia kind of creeping towards us. However, that's sort of even a step beyond that. I think if you look at something like Blade Runner, and if you talk to AI researchers, some of them believe in this thing that's even sort of beyond AGI, which is called artificial superintelligence, or sometimes they call it ASI. And that is the idea of a single AI system that's not only as smart as a person, but is smarter than all of us collectively, smarter than all of humanity collectively. And that's where you start to hear people talk about these scenarios. Like, if such a thing were invented, then of course, that would be very dangerous, because why, such a system would be very hard to control. That such a system might develop consciousness, and then it could pose some sort of existential risk.
Is that just pure? Is that sort of slightly absurd science fiction in your view? The idea of smart machines not only becoming conscious, but essentially enslaving us?
Yeah, I think in the way that science fiction talks about it, it is very much science fiction. I think we have to be careful about a more pernicious way in which we surrender a lot of control to systems that are very much less powerful than that, but yet we sort of give them a lot of authority around very important human decision making, which I think is dangerous. And I think we shouldn't do that. And I think there's a kind of way in which we kind of sleepwalk into a situation in which we've given a lot of authority that we shouldn't give to AI systems. And we wake up, and it's not that the system, has any consciousness or intent to enslave us, but we've sort of enslaved ourselves in that scenario.
It's the frog in the pot, in the boiling water. Yeah. We are talking with Jeremy Kahn, Fortune's AI editor and the author of a new book on AI, another one, Mastering AI, a survival guide to our superpowered future. We've been talking broadly about that superpowered future in the first half of the show. In the second half, I want to get a little bit more granular and talk about how he expects AI to change the different industries, from personal assistance to law to war. We'll be back in a second, but I want to remind everyone that, at least for the moment, humans are still editing our high quality publications, and guys like Jeremy Kahn, our guests, smart guests, human guests, are brought to us by our all too human friends at Liberties, a quarterly publication of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Jeremy to talk more about how we can master AI, perhaps before it masters us. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Jeremy Kahn, the author of Mastering AI. Jeremy, we touched on the issue of personal assistance and a killer app for our AI revolution. You recently wrote something in Fortune on this, about how OpenAI and Google are trying to develop their own AI personal assistants as perhaps the killer app of this revolution. Where are we in this narrative? Are there personal assistants, smart, non-human personal assistants that really are ready for action, ready for the market?
I think we're going to find out very soon, because everyone's working on them, and there's quite a lot of speculation about when exactly it'll be debuted. But Google sort of hinted that it's working on this thing called Project Astra, that it may debut even at the end of this year. OpenAI is believed to be working on a kind of what they call an agentic system, a system that can serve as an AI agent. We know that others are also working on these agents. Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. With Amazon and Apple, they would like to update their current digital assistants like Siri and Alexa to make them smarter, basically, and able to perform much more disparate tasks. And I think we're going to see how well these things work. But that is kind of the dream of a lot of these companies. And it would be the kind of killer app, because it would actually eliminate your need as a consumer to go out and surf a lot of the web, because you could essentially send the agent out to do that for you. You could say, go read all the newspapers, summarize what the news is for me. And then, I need to go, do my online shop. Here's what I need. Go and find the best prices across different sites, buy the stuff for me. You could say it could handle your scheduling. It could handle, restaurant reservations. It could go out and not just tell you ideas for a vacation, which the current chatbots can do. You can ask them, like, I'm thinking of going to Rome, what's an itinerary? You could say, okay, yeah, that's a great itinerary. Go book all of that for me. And it would go do those things. It would secure your concert tickets. It would, not just remind you of when your kids, or wife's, when your anniversary was, but it would go out and buy a present for you.
So it needs to know an enormous amount about
it. Does. Yeah.
So does that make a company like Google, which for many people is still the organizing technology of their lives, does it make Google well placed to lead on personal assistance? And does it also suggest some really complicated problems and issues when it comes to our privacy?
Yes. I mean, I think it's both those things. I think Google is potentially well placed but yes, I think we're going to have to, in order for the systems to work well, they're going to have to know a lot about us. And the question is, where is that information going to be stored? Are we going to trust these companies to know all this information about us? And it's interesting. You've seen Apple kind of come out with a vision of where they think this is going, where they want most of that information to be stored locally on your phone. And they want this AI assistant to do most of its thinking, as it were, sort of on your phone as well, with very little having to be transmitted to a central data center somewhere in the cloud, because they feel like people will be more comfortable with that the information never has to leave the device. I think other people think it's going to be very hard to do really high level reasoning and planning, which a good agent's going to need, and to do all that on the device. And we're basically going to have stuff sent to a central server. And then I think there's going to be this very interesting debate about what permissions we give these systems. But I do think, to be effective, they're going to have to know an awful lot about us. And so there's going to be this trust issue. Which companies do we trust to do this well and to be good stewards of all that personal information?
You wrote an interesting piece, I think a very relevant piece, again in Fortune about, and I'm quoting the title, "The move fast, break shit ethos of today's AI startups is already coming back to haunt them and us." You mentioned in particular Suno, which is OpenAI's video application, and some legal disputes between the entertainment industry and some of these startups. How dangerous is the situation? I mean, we've got Perplexity AI, the leading AI search engine, which has been accused of scraping the web. Is all this ultimately going to benefit the lawyers, but nobody else?
There's definitely going to be some legal disputes. I think the lawyers will do okay out of this. Look, I think, again, if these companies are going to win our trust, and that if they want us to trust them with all of our personal data, they are going to have to prove that they can be good stewards. And already we have seen some of these companies sort of fall down on that. And certainly our history with social media is not a good one. And I think a lot of people are rightfully skeptical about how good a steward these companies can be of our personal information, and that they will actually act in our best interest and not, especially when that might conflict with their own profit motive. And then I think that's why we need regulation. I think it's going to be very hard for these companies to do any kind of self-policing, and we are going to.
What kind of regulation would you like to see in terms?
I'll tell you one thing I'd like to see as we move to sort of personal assistance. One of the things I'm most worried about is actually, I want that personal assistant to, if I'm going to give it my personal information, I want it to actually serve me and not serve some advertiser who's paid the personal assistant company a lot of money to have their results figure higher in what the agent finds for me. And I think that's, one of the real pernicious dangers here. And I think we should say that, and I think, entities like the FTC in the US should police these business models. And we should say that you cannot have a business model that's based on engagement. You cannot have a sort of pay for play situation where companies pay the technology provider, the vendor of the chatbot, to display information that is essentially advertising or marketing copy to somebody, or make recommendations to somebody without it being transparent. That, you're seeing, I'm recommending as the personal agent, the personal agent's recommending to me that you should buy this particular kind of shoe. That's got to be clear if that's coming from Nike or Reebok or something.
We've heard this before, Jeremy, time and time again over the last 20 years. Nothing much seems to have happened. And if we had a big tech person on the show, they might say, well, we still need to make money. Either people have to buy this product, or the business model is driven by advertising. Do you think the consumers are ready to actually pay for example, an AI personal assistant? Might that be the solution?
Oh, I think that would be the solution. But then the question is, you're right. The question is, what does it cost? But I think if you knew for sure that was providing value, and I do think these personal assistants, if we get them right, will provide value, people will be willing to pay something for them. The question is going to be sort of, what are they willing to pay, and is it going to be enough? But I think a lot of people would be willing to pay.
It'll be interesting with Google, given that it's become a multi-trillion-dollar company off the back of the advertising industry. Whether if they're the leaders in these personal assistants, whether they'll cannibalize their own business model. We mentioned that the lawyers are going to do well out of this, at least people lawyers, human lawyers. But you've written about the impact of AI on law. We've done lots of shows on that. I've had Josh Browder, I'm sure his Do Not Pay company's been on the show several times. Is law going to be one of the industries most radically impacted in this first AI revolution?
Yeah, I think so. I think law is sort of a canary in the coal mine for a lot of other knowledge workers and knowledge industries that they're embracing this technology very quickly. It has a lot of potential because ultimately the law. I talked to the head of one of these legal AI companies in the book, Casetext, which has now been purchased by Thomson Reuters, but he said, look, the law is all text. These systems are great at sort of manipulating text and understanding text. The law exists in text. It's all about language. That's sort of all the law is. You don't have to worry about too many other modalities in essence. And I do think this is going to be an area where law is one of the first industries affected. I think it's going to be interesting to see how law handles the issue of training sort of younger lawyers, because traditionally they have, particularly the big firms, have used these younger lawyers kind of as kind of research cannon fodder, as it were. They put thousands of them
they're not
on deals.
co-pilots. They're more like stewardesses.
Yeah, exactly. And they're sent to do due diligence on these big deals where you have hundreds of them descending on a document room and pouring through to find aberrant contracts or issues that could cause legal trouble for the merged company down the line. And I think a lot of that work can go away because these new legal co-pilots that are AI powered will be able to sort of.
So what are we all going to do, Jeremy? I mean, this is the great question, the multi-trillion-dollar question. If indeed we have this age of what you've called co-pilots and technology, AI replaces many doctors, many lawyers, many engineers, many teachers, many journalists. What are we going to do?
Well, I don't think it replaces them. I mean, it may limit the growth of those fields, but I don't think it actually replaces the existing jobs because I don't think the technology is yet powerful enough to do that, and won't be, I think, in the next decade. I think we are in a situation of co-pilots and not autopilots, and so we're still going to need people working alongside these systems. But what they do may change. And I do think the training of younger people may change. And it may be true that law firms need fewer sort of big cohorts of young people, but they're still going to need some. And they're still going to have to hire some bright lawyers that they want to train up to appear in court and to do all the client service things that are really important, that these co-pilots are not going to be able to do all those things. They're not going to have that expertise. And I think a lot of the stuff still comes down to sort of human empathy and human skills. And there's quite a lot of sort of softer skills that are not going to be easy to get into a legal co-pilot and have them perform as well as a big rainmaker, for instance, for one of these firms. So I think for the time being, it's not a situation of mass unemployment. I think it's one of shifting roles. I think it may be one of somewhat diminished opportunities in some fields for large numbers of new entrants, but not that everyone's going to be out of a job. I just think everyone's job is going to change quite radically.
One thing that people always seem to be able to do, at least in the US and even in tough economic times, was join the army. Lots of people doing that, perhaps sometimes to their regret. You wrote an interesting piece for the New York Times on AI ushering in an age of killer robots. Where are we in this narrative, Jeremy?
Just to be clear, that's not a piece I wrote, by the way. I did sort of see it on social media and point out that it was a very
right.
Good piece.
So
I did think it's a piece worth looking at, but I didn't write that particular piece. But I do write it in the book, Mastering AI. I have a whole chapter on AI's impact on war, and I do think it's one of the sort of more terrifying aspects of this technology.
To put it mildly, I mean, where are we in that narrative? Are we beyond the Netscape moment?
Yes. I mean, we are now at the point where we have systems operating in Ukraine that are independently finding targets and choosing to strike those targets, basically without a human in the loop. And that's sort of this Rubicon that's now been crossed. And I think that's very frightening. And I think those systems will spread. And the temptation to move towards sort of full autonomy is really great. And I think the Ukraine again has been this real proving ground where initially everyone said, "Oh, you need a sort of human in the loop in all these systems," and I think battlefield pressure has just been such, and the technology has become capable enough, and the combination of those two things has led people to say, "Oh no, let's just switch the thing into full automatic." It's just it works effectively enough, and we need to make these decisions in areas where communication back to an operator that's working remotely from these systems is just not possible due to GPS jamming, due to electronic warfare. You need a system that can operate essentially on its own. And and the temptation has been to do that, to have systems that are fully autonomous. And I think that's a really frightening moment. And I think we should do everything we can to actually prevent these systems from sort of spreading, although I think it's going to be very difficult.
Well, the crossing of that particular Rubicon is chilling, but you also write in the book and in Fortune about different kinds of Rubicon moments. You write about DeepMind, predicting large swathes of molecular biology. To what extent will AI usher in these profound new scientific breakthroughs that may change everything, go way beyond us all having, for example, personal AI assistants?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest positive impacts of this technology is going to come in the sciences, and in particular in medicine and both drug discovery and more personalized treatments. Um, but yeah, we're already seeing huge breakthroughs in the ability to discover new small molecules to work as drugs, also new proteins that can function as medicines. And there's going to be tremendous, I think, progress in this area in just the next few years.
You're a US-based journalist now living in the UK. You travel around the world. You're involved with the Fortune Brainstorm AI Singapore event in late July, later this month. To what extent is the AI revolution global, or is it different in East Asia, in Singapore and China, in Europe and in the US, or is what will happen, will it happen simultaneously around the world?
I think this is going to be relatively simultaneous. I was just a few months ago, I was doing a big story for Fortune on Microsoft, and I traveled with Satya Nadella on a swing he made, the CEO of Microsoft, on a swing he made through Southeast Asia. And what was sort of striking is a lot of the same AI applications, the same kind of AI tools were being built by developers in Southeast Asia as you're seeing being built in the US and Europe, and basically at the same time, basically simultaneously. And that's actually, I talked to Nadella about this, and he said that was really striking because he felt with a lot of previous waves of technological development, they eventually sort of hit everywhere in the world, but it took some time. And he thought if you were had been talking to developers in Southeast Asia and the first few years of cloud computing back in the early 2000s, very few of them would have been on the cloud yet. They might have seen the potential, but they wouldn't be doing anything with it yet. And it would have taken another 5 years till cloud kind of hit Asia. But AI was kind of hitting all within the same time period, and I think that's interesting. I think this is kind of a global revolution where people are building sort of the same applications. Now, what's different is, for instance, the language abilities of some of these large language models have been very heralded in the press. But it turns out if you move outside of some of the more commonly spoken languages, English, French, German, they're actually usually very good at a couple of the Asian languages, Japanese and Korean, usually pretty good at those, pretty good at Chinese. But if you move to some of the smaller languages, or even languages that are spoken by many millions of people, but are considered lower resource because they have fewer resources available on the internet from which to train a system, the performance of these models often drops off very substantially. So what you do have is people in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, trying to train models that will be particularly adept at those local languages, and I think that is going to be important for how this technology spreads. And is ultimately adopted. So I think that's an interesting development. And that's where you may see a kind of unique twist on this. There are also different social norms. So if you're talking about sort of personal assistants or companion chatbots, I think you are going to see slightly different flavors of these in different parts of the world, because there'll be different cultural norms just about how people converse with one another, that these systems then, they first of all, they pick up from the training data, but also human users are going to want to interact with those systems in slightly different ways, probably, in Asia than they may in Europe or the US. But I think broadly, we're going to see the same kinds of applications being built and the same kind of impacts.
Finally, Jeremy Kahn, the author of Mastering AI, a survival guide to our superpowered future. It's a general reading book. It's designed for outsiders rather than insiders. It's not for Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. It's for people who want to understand the future and master it. Couple of final questions. Very briefly, there are so many products already out there, OpenAI, Anthropic, the Google, Gemini products. Is there one product in particular that you would advise people to use as a front door to this AI revolution, to understand its potential? And secondly, what isn't out there that you would really like to see that's actually possible in the next year or two?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to endorse any particular of the chatbots, but I think as a way to start, you could find some of the ones that are free. So there's like Google's Gemini. There's a version of that that's free, and if you use the Bing search engine, you can access a version of OpenAI's GPT-4 model through Bing Chat. That's free to use. I mean, that's like a low risk way in, because you're not committing any money, and you can start playing around with these things and see what they can do. Some of those systems are a little bit more limited than the paid models. That Claude, Anthropic has a chatbot called Claude. That's very good.
Yeah, I like that one.
There's a free version of that you can access. GPT-4o, the latest OpenAI model, I think is available to anyone. I don't think you could use it all you want all the time, but you can play around with that for free a little bit too. And that's like a good way to, I think you should trying different of these models is a good way to kind of learn some of the nuanced differences between them, and just to kind of get started and see what they can do, see what you can do with them. And if you find it particularly useful, you might want to upgrade to the paid versions, which allow you often to do a lot more, because you can often feed them much more data. There's certain features you can access with the paid models that you can't with the free versions.
And
yeah,
finally,
and you said something about
the
something I'd like to see. Yeah. I mean, I do think these AI assistants, if they work, will be great. And I would like to see the first, I'm excited to see what the first versions of those are going to look like. And how I'm curious to see how good they'll be out of the box, and exactly when they'll be debuted. Because I do think that is kind of going to be the killer app for this technology. And so I'm excited to see, the first of those roll out. And like I said, I'm kind of curious to see how good the first versions will be.
We will see. Jeremy Kahn, the author of Mastering AI, a survivor guide to our superpowered future. We'll have to have you back on the show, Jeremy, when some of these when some of these AI personal assistants come out and we can all use them. Thank you so much, Jeremy, and best of luck with the new book.